Over and over again, the Quran says, do not forget what happened to Abraham when, and then it'll tell a story about Abraham. Do not forget what happened to Joseph, and then it will tell a story of Joseph. And the interesting thing about it is that these stories are presented in sort of a Reader's Digest version. They're sort of summaries of these great stories. The audience that the Quran was revealed to was already familiar with these stories because they were living in a city that was steeped in these traditions.
According to Muslims, one of the most remarkable aspects of the Quran is that Muhammad could memorize the revelations as they came to him and then recite them verbatim to his followers. There was a Kufic script, an early form of written Arabic in existence at the time, but few knew how to read or write it, and Muhammad was no exception.
The belief within Islam is that Muhammad was illiterate. What that underscores then, of course, is on the one hand, the fact that he wouldn't have written these revelations himself. On the other hand, the question is, well, how were they preserved?
Muhammad's small band of followers promptly committed to memory each new revelation they heard, adding verse after verse to the collection already in their heads. Given the oral transmission of many cultures at the time, such feats of memory are unsurprising.
The societies that we are talking about are oral cultures. So in a sense, the oral culture in which Muhammad lived allowed people to listen in something for one time or even two times and have the ability to memorize that and be able to recite it verbatim.
As the catalogue of revelations grew, Muhammad continued to preach on the streets of Mecca, gradually gathering a group of converts around him. His followers came to be known as Muslims, meaning those who submit to God. Muhammad's message appealed especially to the town's poor and underprivileged, who heard their own lives echoed in the verses' pleas for social justice, that slaves should be freed, and that the rich and powerful should give charity to the needy. Some converts to the Quran were entranced by the sheer beauty of the language of the work itself, which they saw as so perfect it had to be the work of God.
When Muslims are asked, well, all right, what proof have you got that this is a divine revelation? Muslims will answer, and they have answered this over 1,000 years, the proof is the Quran itself. That is the miracle, that an illiterate man in the middle of nowhere suddenly produces this magnificent, powerful document.
But some men were distinctly unimpressed by Muhammad. His provocative statements, which refused to recognize the divinity of the idols housed in the Kaaba, infuriated the ruling Quraysh tribe and threatened its position of power.
And if you needed nothing to stand between you and this God, then there's no reason for the idols. And if there's no reason for the idols, then there's no reason for the Kaaba. And if there's no reason for the Kaaba, then there's no reason for Mecca's ascendancy as this social and economic capital of the Arabian Peninsula. So the conflict that the Quraysh had with Muhammad and these revelations was not a theological conflict. It was an economic conflict. It was a political conflict.
The Quraysh and the majority of Meccans showed scant tolerance for the several dozen followers of Muhammad. The Muslims were persecuted. Some were beaten in the streets, others were tortured. For 9 years, the new believers endured the abuse, never wavering from their conviction that there was no God but God. Muhammad himself was protected by his wealthy wife and his powerful uncle, but when they died, the Prophet and his followers realized they had no choice but to leave Mecca.
The social fabric had been so shredded to the point that he did not feel that he would be able to physically continue in his mission in Mecca, and that he would have to begin to search for some kind of alternative base of operation.
The new base would see a new stream of doctrine injected into the Quran, a greater emphasis on law, and a doctrine for war. For 12 years, beginning in 610 AD, the Prophet Muhammad received God's revelation from the angel Gabriel, and he preached it to the inhabitants of Mecca. But life for Muhammad's growing group of disciples became increasingly dangerous there. The city elders rejected the Muslim advocacy of its belief in one God, viciously persecuted the adherents of monotheism, and put a price on the Prophet's head. But then, in the year 622, Muhammad's fortunes turned around.
A group of people from a neighboring oasis came to Mecca looking for someone to arbitrate a dispute they were having. Muhammad, as a prophet, was considered to be an ideal person for this job. And eventually they agreed to take in not only Muhammad and his family, but also a whole group of these Muslims.
Gradually, clandestinely, the small Muslim community made its way 250 miles north to Yathrib, a city which, from that point on, would be called Medina, the city of the Prophet. The new location brought a new position for Muhammad.
Whereas at one point he was a prophet, merely the conduit of God's words flowing through him, in Medina he becomes a leader. His community of Muslims is part of that leadership, but also he is understood to have then an authority over the entire oasis of Medina.
In Medina, the Prophet continued to offer revelations to his followers, but the nature of these verses was noticeably different. According to Muslim historians, they began to reflect Muhammad's status as a leader and added a new element to the overall canon, transforming it into a practical guide to creating and administering society.
The verses are basically about a society that needs regulation. And therefore, the most striking thing about the Medinan period is the laws, or practically all of the legislation that the Quran includes comes from the Medinan period.
The revelations traditionally associated with the Medina period laid the foundations of Islamic law. They included rules covering most aspects of life, from the prohibition of alcohol to the permission to mothers to breastfeed their babies for up to 2 years. The verses provided guidelines for inheritance and legacies, gave new rights to dispossessed persons such as orphans and slaves, and set new rules elevating the position of women in society. But the meaning of some of these laws was not always clear, and many are still debated to this day. A prime example is whether or not the Quran allows polygamy. Marry those women who are lawful for you, up to 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you cannot be equitable, then only 1. Chapter 4, verse 3. At first glance, the verse seems straightforward enough, but Islamic scholars point out that it can be interpreted in different ways.
Some say this means you can have 4 wives. Some say it only means you can have 1 because you can never treat more than one person equally with another person. Some say that it refers only to a very specific situation when there were a lot of orphaned girls available, and the implication was, well, you got to take care of these orphans. So we have to realize that it's not always easy to read out of the text exactly what the implications are for our time or for any time.